Welcome, everyone, to the Indo-American Arts Council's annual literary festival. This year, we celebrate our 6th year of bringing you authors, thought leaders, and storytellers from around the world. Many of these stories originate from the Indian subcontinent. For our 2020 festival, we invite our authors to take center stage to bring people together through the art of storytelling. I'd like to invite you to become a member on our website, www.iaac.us, for free, so we can continue to bring you such programming. Today, we are gathered here to enjoy a conversation between author Oliver Craske and filmmaker Mark Kidel about a new book written by Oliver Craske titled Indian Sun, The Life and Music of Ravi Shankar. Mark Kidel has made a feature-length film on Pandit Ravi Shankar, so we look forward to an engaging discussion. As a musician, I read the book a few months back. It really is a virtuosic portrait of Pandit Ravi Shankar. From his love affairs and hippiedom to life as a cultural ambassador, it really is a comprehensive biography that unpacks his complex legacy. Forever photographed, sitting cross-legged and clutching a sitar with agarbatti burning. Panditji, as he was called, he really has been credited with almost single-handedly spreading Indian classical music to the Western world. He has collaborated with George Harrison, Philip Glass, Sir Yehudi Menuhin. If you've not heard, for example, the East Meets West used to be a cassette tape or now an album. It really is one of the first examples of classical music fusion between two great maestros. Now, this first authorized biography by Oliver Craske is the result of 25 plus years of research and interviews, and it really details Panditji's career from a childhood spent performing as a dancer in his older brother Uday Shankar's troupe, to his tentative beginnings as a sitar soloist, training under his guru, Ustad Alauddin Khan. His fame soared during the hippie movement of the 1960s in the United States, and he spent his twilight years as a recognized composer and Indian classical ambassador. Oliver, it really, to me, appears as a deep understanding of the complex and nuanced traditions of Indian classical music, and emphasizes throughout the book that it's crucial to retain the Indian perspective. In fact, that's a direct quote, focusing not just on the virtuosic showmanship of speed and accuracy, but rather the very serene part of the music, the spiritual, devotional, and the soothing parts. And so for me as an Indian classical musician, I found the book perhaps more interesting not only for its musicality, but rather also because it's unpacked the maestro's life outside of his music. I learned, for example, that Pandit Ravi Shankar lived an eventful and potentially at times a scandalous life. According to the book, he had more than 180 girlfriends over the years and 3 children. They were always ripe material for tabloid speculation, I'd imagine. Panditji went on to marry his guru, Ustad Alauddin Khan's daughter, Annapurna Devi, a great artist in her own right, with whom he had a son, Shubho. Decades of separation, affairs, and absent parenting, which all feature in the book. Oliver reasons that Panditji's absence as a parent was the result of his own father's unreliability, perhaps when he was a boy. He also makes reference to 2 periods of abuse that Panditji referenced when he was a child. There's this beautiful quote that I read in the book, which says, "I have received so much love, but my loneliness has not disappeared." In 1977. And there's another beautiful quote, something along the lines of, "Somehow I got it by inheritance, and I'm carrying it all the time in my life." And I don't know what he means by "somehow I got it by inheritance," but I'd imagine you're thinking the same thing as I did. Oliver paints a fascinating picture of what Panditji has termed his ensuing butterfly lifestyle of multiple relationships, all passion, no commitment. And in the closing section of the book, I found Oliver brings sort of himself into the frame a little bit, recounting his meetings with Panditji in his final years and really untangling of his relationship with his daughters, Anushka Shankar and Nora Jones. Panditji was adamant that Nora Jones's mother, for example, Sue, did not let him see Nora for part of her childhood. And while Oliver sidesteps, I'd imagine, the veracity of this claim, he does explore their later relationship and the developing bond between the two sisters. There's this other beautiful quote that I remember. It says something along the lines of, "You're the best sister I've never had. You're the best sister I've never had," Anushka says of Nora. Ultimately, as he describes Panditji's final performances and last days in hospital surrounded by his family and many proteges, it really is hard not to feel the weight of Panditji's status as an artist, as an Indian artist par excellence, despite his many personal shortcomings, perhaps. "Now I am the music," Panditji said in 2012, a few months before his passing. And it really is in his emotional playing that he lives on. And I feel that Oliver does him justice as a performer, as a composer, and Panditji leaves a complex and enduring legacy that will be unpacked further, I'd imagine, by future disciples of his craft. What an intriguing book. Now let's talk about the author, Mr. Oliver Craske. First, let's welcome Oliver on screen. So Oliver, welcome Oliver. Oliver is a writer and editor from London. He is also the author of a book titled Rock Faces, which is a survey of leading music photographers. Alongside a career as a book publisher, he has had a long-standing interest, of course, in Indian music. He first met Pandit Ravi Shankar in '94, edited his autobiography, Ragmala, and was encouraged by Panditji to write his full story after his passing. Subjects he's interested in range across, biography, music, art, literature, photography, and he's particularly intrigued by the way that artists are formed and shaped by the times and places that they live in, that strange confluence, that complex dance between art and history. Oliver is going to be in conversation with the notable filmmaker, writer, and director, Mr. Mark Kidel. Let's welcome Mark on screen.
Hello.
Hello, Mark. Mark Kidel has made a definitive feature-length film on Pandit Ravi Shankar. So we should have a rather fascinating discussion between the two gentlemen today. Mark's work is often made in collaboration with BBC, with Art France, with ZDF Art, which is essentially Art Germany. He's made award-winning films on Cary Grant, on Elvis Costello, several films on African and African-American music, pianists like Alfred Brendel, Leon Fleischer, architect Norman Foster, musicians Boy George, Rod Stewart, composers Varis, Xenakis, John Adams, etc. So he's a really multifaceted personality. And by the way, may I add, he co-founded WOMAD, the World Music Festival, with Peter Gabriel. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Oliver Craske and Mark Kidel.
Thank you, Anurag.
Thank you so much, Anurag. That's quite an introduction. It's a great pleasure to be on today. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. You've described the book really well. I have to say that this is a book. I read a lot of biographies of musicians, and my craft is to make biographies, but I don't spend 25 years doing them. I usually spend a year and a half, and try and encapsulate somebody's life and work. And I bow down before Oliver for what he's done, because this is a remarkable piece of work. It's outstanding. He manages to do so much. I was daunted by Raviji's life when I decided that I would make this film, because he was already 80. He was celebrating his 80th birthday when I started filming. And we were all worried at that time that he wasn't going to be with us for much longer, because he was in and out of hospital for bypasses and all sorts of different interventions. And we hurried to Delhi to shoot an interview rather impolitely. I think he must have been aware that we, as fast as we could, we went there for a week and shot a week of interviews that were quite extraordinary. Of course, he lived for well over another 10 years. He's a remarkable man, and this is a remarkable book that does justice to one of the great artists of the 20th century, and I probably think one of the great artists of the last 1,000 years. He's really quite amazing, and Oliver really brings this across. I think you've done an amazing job. My first question to you would be, because when I embark on doing a portrait, I mean, I'm a portraitist rather than a biographer. I do portraits that last between 60 and 90 minutes, and I try and show something of the essence of a person. They're very personal films for me, but at the same time, I try and subtract myself from the process of making the film. But in the best cases, what happens, because my approach is very much to try and get the essence, is that the subject basically writes the film. And with Ravi, he basically wrote that film. He decided what we were going to film, where we were going to go. The fact the film begins and ends in Benares seemed to me so important, because Varanasi and all that represents, and the spirituality, the fact that he started out there, and the fact that it's such an important crossing point into the beyond in Hindu mythology and in spiritual practice. It seemed to me, he was the one who led me there. I'd never been to Varanasi before when I discovered it, and it changed me. You can't go to Varanasi. It's said you can't go to Varanasi without being deeply changed.
Agreed.
And you return. I went twice and I haven't returned yet, but I shall definitely return. I nearly went last Christmas. I just wondered to what extent you feel, Oliver, that he kind of wrote the biography, and to what extent you were able to extract yourself from the narrative he wanted to put forward. Because he was very much, he asked you to do it. He obviously felt you were the right person to do it. And maybe I don't know whether he just thought he knew you had talent for that, but whether he felt he could somehow, manipulate's too strong a word, but that he could direct the biography so that it would be a kind of authorized thing. How do you feel about that?
It's a very interesting idea. I don't know. I mean, I should explain that I only really started on it after he died. If we go back, I first met him, as Anurag explained, in 1994, and then I was I assisted him. I edited his autobiography, Ragamala. So at that period, it was a different kind of task, obviously, but he was already sort of planting the seeds in those days. He was telling me certain things about his life that really were not for Ragamala, and he would even say sometimes, "Oh, this can come out after I die." So I think, I don't know, I think it was a bit more subtle. I don't think from day one he said, "This is the person to write the biography." Later on, but we always, even after doing that book, we maintained this connection, and so I kept seeing him. I did more interviews after we'd finished Ragamala, and I would visit him in Delhi or California, and whenever he came through London, which was almost every year because he was touring incessantly. Every year he would do a European tour, health permitting. But so we had this kind of ongoing connection, and in a way the story wouldn't let me go. I mean, at that point I hadn't made no commitment to do this, and for quite a while I think I resisted that role. I felt that I'd done Ragamala and I should do other things, and but towards the end of his life I was really thinking about it a lot again, and one or two people were encouraging me. But it was really only after he died. I mean, I've been given so much by him. I've been given the opportunity to get to know him, to know his inside story. And I had wonderful cooperation from his family, from Sukanya, his second wife, especially, also from Anushka, their daughter, obviously, who was fantastically helpful. And I knew a lot of the people in his life. I knew lots of disciples and people. So I knew I was in the best place to do this, but to what extent did he shape it? I don't know. I didn't feel like that when I was writing it. I felt that you know, it's a long, solitary job writing a book and a biography like this, with a lot of. I spent a lot of time wondering about what my themes were, how I should structure it, and so on. It would have been great if he'd been telling me, "This is how you do it." Perhaps he was more subtly, you know. It's a good question again, because I think as a writer, as a biographer, you're always thinking about how you should tell the story. You know, there are different ways of doing so, and it's one reason I'm particularly pleased to be talking to you today, Mark, because you've done that yourself, as you said. You've told Ravi's life story, obviously in a different medium, and then you have a lot less space to explore it. But you had to make choices as well. I can't believe you just deferred to him in all that work.
No, of course not. No.
No, but he was a very strong personality, obviously, and you know, I could often maybe hear his voice when I was thinking through something, or you know, I would be thinking it in the way, you know, in his words, or in the way he had told a story. So one of your jobs as a biographer is to try to step back a bit and to think about the life from different perspectives. So I wanted to interview as many people as possible who knew him, which was something that really impelled me to get on with it after he died, because I felt this new impetus. He was no longer around, but there were so many people of his generation who also had died or were elderly. And you have to, you know, a bit like you going to Delhi in, I think, 2000, rushing out there because you wanted to get on with it. It was a little different. He had gone, but I was very conscious that there were lots of other people who might not be around much longer. And so I wanted to get on with it at that point. But yes, you have these different competing voices or ideas about how you tell a story. But I wanted, you know, I was conscious that he'd been interviewed so much in his life. You know, he was such a high-profile figure, and he was always asked to, you know, he might be, the sort of potted introduction of his life story might be quite familiar. You know, some of the things that everyone knows about him, whether it's Woodstock or Monterey Pop or his great friendship with George Harrison, his influence on the likes of Yehudi Menuhin and Philip Glass. Of course, very often he would give the same answers. He was asked the same questions. So like anyone does, this is not a criticism of him, like anyone does in interviews, you start to produce a narrative. And what's very interesting as a biographer is to be able to go to other sources that start to challenge some of those narratives. And I don't see it as in any way reflecting badly on him. That's his life. You have a version of your story, and you forget exactly how something's happened. Incidentally, he had a very, very good memory, but nobody's perfect. So that's a long answer to your question, but that whole issue of how you decide how you're going to tell the story is a massive thing in writing a book like this.
Well, and I think the thing about Ramiji is that there's so many layers.
Yes.
And I'm very conscious that, and I've thought about it ever since. I mean, no film is perfect, just as no person. I mean, far from that. I mean, I'm reasonably satisfied with the film because it does all sorts of things that are non-verbal. It's film.
Yes.
So it's the advantage of film is you can. I mean, the film plays with. I was writing to a friend who watched it the other day, a Polish friend. She watched it a couple of days ago, actually, and was very touched by it. I mean, she'd been to India. She was into Indian and Sri Lankan spirituality. But there's a lot in that film about the elements and about colours. It's very conscious because we talked, he and I. It's not explicit in the film, but I'd read enough about Indian classical music to know the connection between the ragas and different forms of weather, different times of the day, different colours, and all that. And I wanted to get that sense of that in the film. So there's all of that.
Yeah, it's a very fine film. I watched it again last night, actually, and yeah, I was very moved by it. And you know, as you say, a lot of it is done more subtly. You can do that.
I'm an artist rather than a biographer, so I have the license to to play around with certain things. So when I was in Varanasi, I was there. A friend of mine who called Richard Lanoy, you've probably come across, who took some of the very best photographs of Varanasi in the 1950s. He was a disciple of Sri Anandamayi, and he's taken the best photographs of her at the ashram. And I remember thinking I would go there with a crew. And he said, no, Mark, you've got to go for longer than you could possibly afford with the crew. Go on your own and shoot the stuff yourself. And so I went, and he recommended, it's a lovely hotel sort of on the edge where all the people who are studying at Benares University stay. It's called the Benares something. It's lovely. It's an art gallery as well. And it's right on the edge of the Ganges, and it's sort of vegetarian. It's a very unusual hotel, and I would just hire a boat and go out and shoot stuff. And I could go out, you know, to see the arti taking place at dawn, and catch that light and that moment and all that sort of thing, which are very important in the film. Mm-hmm. But I think the one I think I've communicated the importance of the spiritual work, the core of what Indian culture is about in a way that Western culture is not, and which is what attracted me when I first heard. I went to hear Ravi Shankar in about 1963 on the South Bank, my first concert. So there were LPs were around, and I remember, you know, I was 63. I wasn't quite a hippie yet, but on my way. But for me, the thing that's not in the film and which you go into, and that was clearly very, very important, because the way he talked to me about it, I realized how important it was. But it was too long a story to tell in the film, was his encounter with Tat Baba. I mean, the exact details, he told me in real detail of how, you know, when he was about to commit, you know, for contemplating suicide after his separation from Annapurna, and this beggar comes to his door, or apparent beggar, whom he realizes isn't like any old beggar, and asks for a glass of water. And how this man turns out to then transform his life. And the man who finds him miraculously. I mean, that side of how his life unfolded, I wasn't really able to communicate in the film. And in a way, that's the great mystery of life. It's not just the mystery of the life of somebody like Ravi Shankar. It's the way that, why did I do this film? What did it do for me? Why did you do this book? Mm. And in what sense were you chosen, not by Raviji, but by some other force? I mean, whatever it is that Tat Baba communicates. I'm getting very, very esoteric at this point, but I think it's important, because I think his life, all the time, I got the feeling that he was, I would be interested to see what you feel. He was being pulled back to that core, that there were temptations, whether it was as a young man, well, as a boy, with Uday Shankar being toasted in Hollywood by Mary Dressler wanting to adopt him, and all these parties and staying in five-star hotels. And then this point at which, I mean, in my film, I make it very, very simple, as if it happened overnight, when, you know, he suddenly decides to go to study with Alauddin Khan, and gives up the five-star hotels and is, you know, in a tiny room with a mattress on the floor and insects and reptiles and God knows what. That there's a kind of toing and fro, inevitably, because he's bridging East and West. That's what Tat Baba told him was his destiny, from what I understand. That his role was to build that bridge, which of course he did. But that there's the temptation of the material world, living in the material world, as George Harrison talked about it, and then being pulled back to what really matters, which is at the heart of what the music is really about and what spiritual practice is about.
Mm. Well, I think in your film, the spiritual comes across very clearly. And as we've said, you do it through in various ways, and some of that is through the music, which is you have the great advantage of in a film that I don't have in a book, is to actually be able to play the music. It's interesting you mentioned the episode in 1948 when he came close to committing suicide. So for me, when I was thinking about doing this book, there were a lot of things I wanted to communicate. Not least, I felt that here was somebody about whom there was a lot to say, even though he was very famous. But I felt there was a lot more that needed to be communicated. I think there were aspects of his life that people had either forgotten or not really known about. But there was a particular thing that really bugged me, and I was, when I was thinking about how I structure the book or what am I really looking at here, I kept coming back to that episode in 1948 when he came so close to committing suicide. I mean, it's completely fascinating how Tat Baba arrives at his house like it's in some sort of mythological tale, and arrives randomly, but is actually there, it turns out, to rescue him. But it also really intrigued me as to how he had become so low that he was suicidal. Because the person I knew from 1994 onwards was, this great life force, this incredible personality who was so much fun to be with. And he, being in a room with him, he was always there was this aura about him, but he did it in a very gentle way. You wanted to spend more time with him. And I felt this myself, and I saw it in other people. And by talking to other people, I knew that was the same experience they'd had. And also as a child, he seemed to have such vitality. And, from a young age, he was obviously special. There was something about him. So I was really intrigued as to how somebody at this point, when he was about 28, had become so low in his life that he wanted to give it all up, And that really intrigued me. And obviously he was a very sensitive personality. I mean, as an extremely sensitive artist, and that, that brings with it highs and it brings lows. I think, he felt things very deeply. But I always wondered if there was something more to it. And there wasn't very much I could find out about that period. It was oddly enough, it was a period where he was just starting to become well known in India. But there was a lack of either documentary sources or news cuttings. Later in his life, you could tell aspects of his story by people who are still alive, or a lot of interviews he gave. But that's almost like a slightly, I call it in the book, like a slightly dark period. The dark ages of his life in a way, around the sort of mid 40s. There's not as much documentary coverage. There's more in the 30s because, of course, he was a dancer in his brother Uday's famous dance troupe, and they got a lot of press coverage. And I found a lot of letters relating to that time. So I was always really very intrigued by this moment in his life, and that really, I felt that what I discovered about him and the very sad sexual abuse he had in childhood. Then things started adding up. And that's something he never told anyone until his 70s, when he told Sukanya, who is, I believe, the only person he ever told. But many things started to add up. I mean, Anurag in his introduction talked about this aspect that I highlight in the book, where he so often, in candid interviews, talked about a sense of loneliness that he had in life. And talking to Sukanya, also Anushka in particular, was very interested in this aspect of him. As she says in the book, that and how the trauma may have affected his personality later on. And I think that was coming out at that time in his life. It was a low period for various reasons. Not so much, I think, because of his marriage. I think at that point the marriage to Annapurna was, probably tense, but they'd sort of got back together once already. And it was not until 1956 really that was a big bust up. I think there were things going wrong in his life. There was a big legal dispute with a business partner that became very nasty. He felt he was struggling. He wasn't achieving what he wanted to do, and he just got lower and lower. And I think that this sort of deep loneliness within him, this sadness, this loneliness, it was overwhelming him. So you have this great pivotal moment in his life when he's in despair, but the universe isn't silent. Somebody comes and knocks on his door at the moment when he was feeling at his most alone, and that really, you can imagine how powerful that was on him.
But that's a classic. You talk about the arrival of Tat Baba being like out of a mythological tale. but also the notion that we are only saved, in that sense, rescued, when we're at our lowest ebb, and it's only by confronting our demons or the abyss that we're able then to do great things. It's almost like it's like a hero's quest of some sort. I mean, I think you're right. I mean, for me, I didn't know about the abuse. I always wondered about the suicide thing. I couldn't quite make sense of it. When he and I talked, because he told me the story verbatim in much detail. He was a great storyteller, and I enjoyed it enormously. Not on film. But he talked about having been betrayed in this business thing that you mentioned. Yeah. He felt he'd been betrayed by somebody he really cared for. But that's not a reason for committing suicide. But abuse, having been a victim of abuse myself, nothing like as badly as him, but as an adolescent, I know it's something that leaves incredible scars to do with shame and to do with asking oneself why it happened, why me, and a thing that's never truly resolved. So I suspect you're right. That is the sense of shame, but also there is just the sensitivity in him that he's both a superhero because he's able to do so much and he's blessed with such extraordinary talent, but he knows himself that virtuosity is not enough. I mean, I think that's the other thing, is that's a very lonely path when you know that, as he put it, and you mentioned this. I mean, it's interesting when you mentioned earlier about the things that he would repeat in interviews. When I was reading the book, I thought for a minute, hang on a minute, is this a transcript of my film? And I think, no, he must have just said it to Oliver as well. Because he's using the same phrases, talking about key moments. And clearly what you've done is unpick a lot of that spiel, which he was so good, like all people who are interviewed over and over again, they will come up. It's very rare that somebody can improvise. I mean, it's happened to me only the only film I've made where I've had big success and a lot of interviews was the film about Cary Grant. So I was endlessly doing Q&As at festivals, and I tried very, very hard not to repeat myself, but it's just impossible.
Yeah.
Because you found some good things to say, and you try and improvise on the raga and go in a slightly different direction, but it doesn't quite work out.
Yes. I mean, that's a good analogy because, it's the masters who can really improvise the most beautiful, melodies. The rest of us, we're maybe using more familiar refrains.
Now, this is a question that's just come up in my mind, talking about mastery. While in the last 20 years since I made the film, and possibly before as well, one or two people have said to me, oh, but he's really not the best. Ali Akbar, for instance, just to name one example, is a much greater musician than Ravi ever was. Did you find when you were talking to people that was there a tremendous amount of benevolence towards him, or were there people who felt he was overrated as a musician because of his flamboyance, his ability to communicate, his charisma, his network because of his charisma and charm, the friends he was able to make, whether it was Yehudi Menhuin or George Harrison, who worshipped him. There's no question. They thought he was a god, which in some ways he was, perhaps, but certainly in their eyes he was. But did you come up against people who felt the god needed to be taken down from his cloud or pedestal?
Well, I've certainly heard that opinion quite a lot, that, other people preferred Vilayat Khan or Ali Akbar Khan or whoever. And that's absolutely fine. Everyone can have their favourites. I think the more interesting criticism, the way I interpret it, is that people who felt that because he was such a good person at presenting, he was so good with media, he was charismatic, because of all that, and because he was so successful as well, because he was, had this incredible success that no one else did, none of his contemporaries, that therefore he must have been dumbing down, or he must have been lightweight in some way. And that's something I really recognise a lot of people feel that. They feel that automatically, oh, we don't mention him in quite the same words as we would some of these other musicians who are the real masters. And I, while as I say, I respect everyone's opinion, I really feel that's wrong. I don't think there's a competition here, but I think he should be up in that top echelon. I feel that some people resist the idea that he's great because he was so popular. And that's one thing I wanted to kind of investigate in the book, is to try and, to explore what, it's what a biography does, explore what he actually did. And I think a lot of it people don't know or they forget, including, as Anurag said in the introduction, what he did in India before he ever became a big star, which is very much forgotten, about how, why was he the person in 1956 to go out and start trying to persuade the rest of the world about this music? It wasn't just because Tut Baba thought it was a good idea, or, there were lots of reasons, but one of them was that he was the best person to do this, and he was by that point one of the most famous classical musicians in India, and one of the most popular ones, and one of the most respected. So, there's more to it than a random encounter with George Harrison in 1966, which I think is quite a lot of people's interpretation. But yes, I encounter some resistance and different views from various people. People who knew him always had respect for him. I felt that they, there was usually a personal affection because he was so likable. And anyone who worked with him had enormous respect for him as a musician. I saw that. I can't think of anyone who didn't, apart from Andre Previn, who for some reason they just didn't get on. But I think there's quite a big gap between them in all kinds of ways. That just wasn't bridgeable. But so many people would just rave about him, and through all traditions, including Indian.
No, I'm brought. It's whether there's obviously there's jealousy, and I've sensed that with some people I've spoken to, or reflected jealousy because they've had somebody in another school or whatever say to them, well, he's not the real thing. Yeah. That person was jealous, and that's parted on. No, I just remember him telling me, and it's not quite in. I don't think it's in the film explicitly. But when I was filming him working with Anushka at the house in Delhi before they had the foundation, and enormous love and affection there. But afterwards, he said he had a tremendous regret about the fact that she'd become an American kid, basically, and that he hadn't insisted on her, learning. Well, he didn't acknowledge her for a long time, as we know. But I mean, he didn't. That she hadn't been schooled from a very young age, and that to pick up the sitar as late as she did, he implied she would never really get to be as good as she might have done, which is quite an interesting. Yeah, he was very clear about that. I mean, obviously she's proved him wrong because she's done incredibly well, and she's experimenting in the way that he does, and she's an immensely talented, gifted musician.
Yeah, well, I mean, he actually started relatively late for a classical musician. Yes. Until the age of 10, he was only playing around by his own admission.
Right. So and it's interesting. So there he may have actually been talking about himself.
Yeah. Yes. That's very possible, actually. Yeah.
And maybe he felt that he could have been, the sitar equivalent of Tanzen and his singing in the 16th century. That he could have, that somehow he never quite. I mean, he was always trying to get further. I mean, that's very clear. The things he said to me that nothing. He was endlessly getting further along the road and getting more inspiration.
Yeah, I mean, he really, he absolutely believed in this. It's an ideal of music. Many musicians around the world, but especially in Indian classical music, that you're constantly learning. I mean, it never stops, and that he felt, in his old age, that his musical brain was better than ever. He was more creative than ever, and there was more to go. And there's a lovely quote I found that I end the book with, perhaps I shouldn't spoil the punchline, but about how he wanted to come back in the next life, and what would he be doing in the next life? Will he be a musician again? He absolutely believed that you constantly learn, you constantly improve. So I'm sure he would have thought, well, I wish I started a bit younger. So I suppose Anushka was actually probably a bit younger than he was when he started. She was 7 when she started having lessons with him. Lessons. But his own youth was so extraordinary. I mean, there was the influence of Varanasi, which, as you were saying, and as I agree, it has this incredible aura around it, this sort of spiritual aura that is tangible there. And that was definitely in him. And then there's the change at the age of 10 when he joins his brother's dance troupe. And, no other Indian musician had that kind of background, that training, that he spent his youth, not only performing as a dancer and a musician, doing it on foreign stages and learning about how you present Indian arts to audiences who don't understand it. So he had all this kind of training. He understood, he understood Western people, he understood Western music, he understood their expectations, and that all helped shape what he did later on. So those first 18 years of his life before he actually committed to being a disciple of Alauddin Khan were incredibly useful to him, and all part of making him the incredible musician he was. And there's many, many different aspects to him as a musician. You think about how, he had an obsession with orchestral music. There's a wonderful document I found in the course of delving through the family archives from 1961 that I quote in the book, where he says, my greatest ambition ever since childhood is to create the ideal Indian orchestra. Because, Indian classical music didn't have this orchestral tradition. It's very much a solo form. And that was another thing that was controversial. But it was there. That was from his playing in his brother's troupe. It was also from Alauddin Khan, who had his Maihar band, an ensemble of Indian musicians. So all these influences come together early on in his life, and they play out not only in terms of sort of family and trauma and so on, but also artistic influences that are so important from early on, and they never go away.
I've always had a problem, as I think I think I've told you before, with the collaborations with classical music. And I sort of find the footage and the recordings with Yehudi Menwin, in spite of Yehudi Menwin's brilliance, heart, commitment, love of Raviji, love of Indian music, that there is something fundamentally different between a tempered scale, where the microtones really don't play very much role. Well, maybe there's vibrato. Obviously, there are some genre like gypsy music, perhaps, or klezmer, where that's not classical music. But that so it's a difficulty for me, because when Raviji talks about Indian classical music, he talks about the Shruti, he talks about and the importance of this and its spiritual value. And for me, so this has always been a problem, whether it's been the concertos or whether the things with Yehudi Menwin, where Yehudi Menwin sort of plays, but it seems to me it's a bit like when classical musicians try and play jazz. I'm an enormous jazz fan, and I've loved jazz for a very long time. Even played it rather badly in a band at school. But I think there's certain unbridgeable gaps, and I just wondered whether he'd ever voiced any misgivings about, and whether there was an element of, because one could argue sometimes that somebody from Africa who decides they want to play with a string quartet, even if it might be the Kronos quartet, who do stuff, again, which I have doubts about with Malian musicians, that there's a desire to be respectable. And it's a sort of post-colonial thing, where the colonial power said, Western culture, the classical tradition is it. Anything else is inferior. I mean, I don't think Raviji ever felt that.
No.
But I just wondered whether he'd ever displayed any misgivings about, particularly this thing around microtones.
No, I don't think so. I mean, after all, the last piece he wrote in his lifetime was an opera. It was bringing Indian classical music into a Western operatic setting. I don't think he did have misgivings. I think he was endlessly curious and was trying to work out the best ways for these forms to meet. Yeah. But
I confess to being a bit narrow-minded about this, and I don't think of myself as a purist, but in this context, I am, perhaps.
But I found it also very interesting that some people would have a resistance to certain parts of his oeuvre, including, you mentioned Yehudi Menuhin. I mean, it was fascinating to me that Menuhin, initially, he absolutely loved all the basic solo Indian classical music, which is a solo line. It's played in Western forms we would talk about a modal form. The key doesn't change. It's all about the invention of the melody line and its interaction with rhythm, and you have a drone underneath. And of course, that becomes rather complicated. You're playing orchestral forms. Then they're no longer, improvisation. They can't be. So Menuhin had quite a resistance. There was a newspaper article I found in the early '60s where he actually wrote in the Times in London against the idea of Indian orchestral music. This is exactly the time when Raviji is doing that kind of work for All India Radio and in stage performances and in film as well. Of course, he was a great film composer. And I don't think Menuhin actually had Ravi in mind when he was saying this. I think he was thinking about Indian sort of Bollywood cinema. But I was really struck by that they seemed to be on a different side of that argument. Menuhin came round. He was very, very complimentary about the later concertos, sitar concertos that Raviji wrote. But again, I found a letter from Menuhin that Raviji sent him a copy of Chants of India when it came out in 1997. And Menuhin wrote back and he said, I got halfway through the CD and it just doesn't work for me.
Oh, no. It's it's probably of my entire CD collection, the CD I most play, including jazz, classical, rock, whatever. I get endless pleasure out of it. I mean, not pleasure is the wrong word. It inspires me deeply. It's a masterpiece.
It's a wonderful, wonderful album, but it's very interesting that somebody who was such a big fan of Raviji and his music had a resistance to that. He said in the letter something like he didn't see what he really wanted. What he liked was that solo form where he's sat on the ground with the tabla player and the tambura is behind him and the incense burning and that whole, which was, that whole beautiful reverential experience in a way, which is how he had first come across Indian music through Raviji when he met him in 1952 in India. So I think that Menuhin had a sort of ideal picture of this is what I most love about Indian music, and it completely inspired him, and for the rest of his life. But he had that resistance when it came to something like the Vedic chants, and so it doesn't surprise me or disappoint me that people might dislike certain aspects of his music. I mean, I'm an all-over fan. I think they're all fascinating and beautiful and brilliant, and some bits are better than others, but it's all fascinating. And I don't think that you mentioned this idea that maybe an African or an Indian musician working with a Western orchestra is somehow engaging in almost like a post-colonial or colonial kind of relationship. That you're gaining credibility by playing with a Western orchestra. But I don't think that was Raviji's feeling, really. I mean, the thing he's most remarkable for me is that he wanted to turn the rest of the world onto Indian music. That's so consistent. I mean, people talk all about his collaborations and they're remarkable, but he's always playing Indian music. I mean, that's, anything he composed was always based on ragas and talas. And when you think about that, it's very striking that, he was on such a mission. He wouldn't let go of that. He wasn't diverted into, jamming with jazz musicians, in random directions. It just didn't interest him. It was a kind of missionary work for Indian classical music. So although yes, he loved writing for Western orchestras or Indian orchestras, but I think that's all part of the role as a musician, as a creative musician. You just want to try out what can be done. And I love some of that. His second sitar concerto in particular is just fabulous stuff in it. I think I came to appreciate it even more through detailed listening for the book.
I must probably give it another listen.
Yeah.
One's taste can change, or one's reactions to things can change.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But he was interested in so many different musics. I was just talking with Sukanya recently, and she was telling me how in later in his life, actually he was listening to more non-Indian music than Indian music. Very interesting. He's constantly, exploring, that endless curiosity that he had.
I think Sukanya's role in all this is absolutely crucial.
Absolutely.
There's no question, and you make that clear in the book. I mean, I found that. But there's a sense in which his life, even though he was unhappy, there was sadness in him, which goes with being a sensitive person, as you all said. You can't be sensitive in this world and not feel sad at certain times about all sorts of things: mortality, poverty, disease, whatever. There's so many things, the lack of freedom. So I think in some sense, he remained this very, very sensitive child, because there was a childlike quality with him. I mean, even at 80, that's
very much
incredibly playful, and it made him. He preserved that without being in any way childish or it being a pretense. It was just, as you say, he was endlessly curious, which I think is the key to a long and fruitful life, is to remain curious. But Sukanya was a real midwife to all that. I mean, I think she was stern. She knew how to, she knew how to, in a sense, she knew how to run his life, because somebody had to. And I marveled at the way she managed that. And I think I love that sequence in the film, in my film at the end. I mean, I still, every time I see it, when they go around the almost finished foundation and describe what it's going to be, and he keeps calling the servants staff, and she says they're not. No. She calls them servants, and she says they've got to be called staff. And it's also the nice moment in the film, because I mean, of course, I knew about all the girlfriends and the flings and all that. I didn't realize quite the extent that's enumerated, 180 or whatever it is. But perhaps if you live 90 years, that's not so much. But I managed to have that. There's a little moment when they go around the place, and they're looking out of the window, and they're building the foundation next to a girls' school, and it's the playgrounds. And she teases him about the fact that he's going to be looking at the girls playing out on the sports field.
Yeah.
And there's a kind of knowingness about it, and everything about the fact that, and the way he reacts, that he loves women, and you don't need to dot the I's, and you leave it to the imagination of people, which I think is always the best way with a film like this. I mean, I've not been interested in exposing people unless they've wanted to open up about aspects of their lives they wanted to talk about on screen, as has been the case with some people I've made films about.
I mean, he was unusually candid about his private life, especially for an Indian musician or public figure. So I felt it was fine to talk about that kind of material, because he talked about it, and Sukanya is an incredibly honest and bold and open person, and she knew he'd had a complicated past, and that was fine, and it's all part of understanding him. I felt that it's not about being salacious. I think that, it's well known that, especially among Indians, that he had a complicated life, a complicated private life. I became convinced that it was really the collapse of his marriage with Annapurna in 1956 that sparked this off. That I didn't really find, I believed him when he said that it was only then that he started having all these affairs. I mean, as a teenager in Paris or New York, I'm sure, he had girlfriends. But I think from the point when he married at the age of 21, that I think this, they made a good go of it. It was a stormy relationship. He was married to his guru's daughter, obviously. But I think, I've ended up sort of compartmentalizing different periods of his life. It was only when it broke down in 54, 55-ish, really, that, and then in 56, there was a big split, and then they were actually apart for nearly 3 years. They got back together, but it was never really. After that, it was a bit of a facade. So in the period when people often think that he was, he was having a lot of girlfriends, but it was a long period of about 30 years until it really, by the mid 80s, that he'd when he was in his early mid 60s, that was the end of that period, and then he married Sukanya, and it was a very happy, fulfilling second marriage, and I think she was the right person for him. As you said, that she had that role of running his life, and it's what he needed, and he knew he needed it. Things had become a bit chaotic, and he started to repair his relationships with his daughters, which was incredibly important to him in the latter part of his life, that they were able to build such strong relationships, and also that he was able to focus on his music, and by that point there were so many demands on him, and his health was starting to fail a bit, and he couldn't keep up with everything that was needed, and all the complexities that he had created in his life. So yes, I think you're quite right. She was very, very important for that latter period, the last sort of 2 or 3 decades, I suppose, of his life. The period when I knew him.
No, she was very helpful to us making the film. But talking about reconnecting with his daughters, there's a lovely moment in the film when I started working on the film, and he told me that they'd been touring in Paris and with the Uday Shankar troupe. I asked my researcher, I said, just check that Pathé News in France didn't film this, because it's the kind of sort of thing they would have filmed. Less than 24 hours later, she'd found this bit of film that Raviji never seen. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't silent. It was with sync sound, and it's absolutely priceless. And so we decided we'd film him in his place in Encinitas, in California, watching it for the first time. And it so happened that Nora Jones, who at that point wasn't really Nora Jones, she hadn't put out her first album.
No,
I think they had I think they may have. Was she known as Gayatri? She had an Indian name, and they didn't call her Sarah. They didn't call her Nora.
No.
And she looked quite different. And she hadn't sort of developed star quality at all. And it's lovely. They're sitting on the sofa, the Sue sisters, sort of wrapped together like kittens. And while he watches himself, and they're hooting with laughter, seeing him there. You see him very briefly. I mean, he's not the star of the news item. Obviously, he's just one of the musicians, and the smallest of all the musicians, I think. But I had
she's Gitali. I had a memory blank, but
Gitali. That's
Gitali,
it. Yes, I knew it was something with G.
Gitali Nora Jones Shankar, but she obviously.
But in those days, they called her Gitali.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He called her Gitu. Yeah.
And it was before the first album had come out on Blue Note. Yeah. But I don't know, maybe we come to the end of this, but there's a question that comes to mind. And he talks, it's inevitable, because it's a question that one asks a lot of Western classical music. musicians now is how you survive now. I'm hopefully making a film about a daughter of Sri Lankan parents who's a very, very gifted pianist in France called Shani De Luca. She's just done an album for Warner's called Cosmos, in which she juxtaposes, doesn't play them together, ragas played by Indian musicians, classical musicians, and a couple of Beethoven sonatas. And she's done the two because it's fairly clear that Beethoven had read some of the Upanishads. There was a tremendous vogue amongst the German romantics for reading Hindu texts. And so she's trying all sorts of ways of bringing classical music to younger audiences, working in prisons, doing things like a project with she's doing a big project around Proust for the anniversary of his birth and his death, the next 21 and 22. But I just wondered whether, when you'd spoken to Raviji in the later years, whether he talked about the future of Indian classical music. I mean, the real tradition of playing ragas, doing all-night concerts, and the tradition of Indian, Hindustani vocals, all that. Whether he felt that was under threat and how best to keep that going.
Yeah, he often did, and I found that his mood often veered wildly. Like from one meeting, he might be feeling very positive because something had happened lately, and then sometimes he would be feeling terribly depressed about, because some other event had happened. So I think this is this sensitive personality again, that he'd be very affected by what had been happening lately. He had obviously had a very, very deep belief in the greatness of the music. I think that he felt that as long as people had the opportunity to hear it and see it performed in classical recitals, that it would continue to survive. But obviously right now, in the middle of this global lockdown and shutdown of musicians, I mean, that's quite a pertinent point. People have to be able to see art forms in order to appreciate them, and hopefully when we're all back in concert halls and festivals, Indian music will still be there. I think I think that's my own belief, is if it's given the limelight, or however you put it, then people will be interested in it. And so people like Raviji are very important because they can play that role of promoting it, if you like, and nobody did it better than him. But I suppose now Anushka is doing that fantastically well. And I think, as I said, his moods swung around a bit, quite a lot on that question, and it certainly bugged him.
Did you find him sometimes dissatisfied with concerts, or was he philosophical about the fact they just went the way they went?
It's a good question. I'm having to think about that one now. I think that he, sometimes he knew when something hadn't gone perhaps as well as it should have done. But I don't know. I mean, I saw him, must have seen him 15 or 20 times or something. I don't know. I haven't counted actually. They were all wonderful experiences in my view. But he might have been a bit dissatisfied about something. But good question.
No, I just wondered if there had been occasions when the tabla player missed a beat, as it were, or I mean, maybe they're all completely in command of the tabla.
Yeah, I bet you Anushka's got some good stories about that kind of episode.
Kind of inside stories.
Okay. Yeah.
Ask Zakir Hussain on a drunken night or something, he might then come out with some interesting stories.
Yeah, well, there's some sort of tensions. There's always lots of tensions among the musicians, but I always loved that, being around those concerts. Not only, and I had the fortune of sometimes being, there beforehand when they were sound checking, and got to know lots of the musicians, and just such a wonderful world. These fantastic, not only Ravi Ji. I mean, he was obviously brilliant, but so many great tabla players, the likes of Chandra Bose, Vikram Ghosh, and Zakir Hussain, of course, as you mentioned, and what a great world, I mean, I think so many people who've fallen in love with Indian classical music have done so by going to a concert. So for me, I love listening to it on hi-fi systems and watching videos, but there's still nothing like a live performance where you see the interaction between the musicians, and you really sense the kind of level of mastery, and then also that ability to let go and improvise, and it's inspirational.
We only really get a tiny bit of it in the West. I mean, I knowing not that much about North Indian vocal music, I once asked Ravi Ji to give me, I've still got in my notebook from that film, in his handwriting, a list of the albums I should get. It's long, it's about 4 or 5 pages.
Great.
All the singers he thought, alive and dead, that I should check in with. And I sort of dutifully went off and got the CDs, and wow, the riches of vocal music. And of course, it's the heart of the whole thing.
Yeah.
It's the voice. And
it is. It's the root of all the music. And
exactly. Yeah.
Say everything that can be played can be sung.
Well, and they're trying to sound like the voice when they're playing.
Yeah.
It's the breath.
Yeah. And of course, when he would teach, he would often teach with the sitar, but he would often just teach by singing.
Yeah.
And that's how all the classical musicians work. He had a great voice as well, a great singing voice.
Well, he sings quite a bit on Chants of India, as does Sukanya.
Yes, he does.
I can recognize his voice now on some of the.
Yes.
Some of the.
Yes, actually, some of my favourite music of his, he's actually singing on. I think of Prabhu. I was going to say Prabhuji, which is wonderful, but he is on that, of course.
Which I use at the very end of my film.
Yeah.
And I weep every time I hear that. Prabhuji.
It's incredible. The song I was trying to think of was Prashanti, on the last track on Passages, the album with Philip Glass, where he sings this just heartbreaking Hey Nut. It's a heartbreaking prayer. So much tenderness in that. For somebody who's known as an instrumentalist, that's an incredible vocal performance.
I think we should. I consider myself so fortunate to have been around him, to have been in the room eaten meals with him.
Yes.
I've been working with his students.
Yeah.
I mean, going to watch the girls doing Bharatanatyam dancing, which, by the way, that was his idea, because the connection with South India, of course, is incredibly strong.
Yes.
And Sukanya was always the first to say it all comes from South India. That's where it's the purest.
Yes, we haven't talked about that.
That was one area I thought, because that's something I learned from them. I mean, I'd always loved South Indian music, and I eventually went down there with Sushila Raman to Tamil Nadu and heard some pretty amazing temple music there. And I mean, she was doing some interesting sort of crossbreeds between Jimi Hendrix and South Indian music with some very good local musicians. But it was important to him. In what way do you think, particularly?
Well, musically, I think the rhythm in particular was very, very important. I mean, there's a fantastically complex sort of mathematical approach to rhythm in South Indian music that he brought into his music. He's obviously a North Indian Hindustani musician, but he brought that in. And then I think it also goes back to the days in the dance troupe in his youth, because they incorporated elements of Bharatanatyam and Kathakali, and the troupe toured South India. As I found out, they actually toured. So in about 1934, and so I think he was like a sponge. He was soaking this all up. At the same time he encountered Bharatanatyam on that same trip. He saw Bala Saraswati dancing when she was very, very, very early in her career, and then subsequently, if you go forward a decade or two, when he's director of music at All India Radio, a period I felt was really important in his life and in the book. He was a kind of gatekeeper for Indian musicians, all kinds of Indian musicians on the radio. And he made a big feature of including Carnatic musicians as well as Indian. And this is national radio being played all over the country. So it's really important in the formation of a kind of nationally recognised classical traditions. North and south are both equally valid. He also ran his first orchestra there at the Vadi Vrind, the Orchestra of Indian Instruments, and that included South Indians as well as North Indians. So it was all there all along. He very, very important to him. So I think that with the typical focus on him as this international artist who took Indian music out to the world, which he did, of course. I mean, that's the thing he's best known for. But he was also an important figure within India. By the time of the mid-50s, he was as I said, very high profile and successful. And he was also this kind of gatekeeper who was, playing Indian musicians for Indians to hear. And, of course, a lot of people hadn't heard that, they wouldn't have, if you were in the north of India, you wouldn't have heard, it's unlikely you'd have heard a South Indian musician. And before radio, before mass media, it just wasn't there. And radio, I was really struck by the fact that radio didn't boom in India until after independence. It held it back. And so he was there at that very moment when the radio is starting to reach all around the whole of India, and he's the one playing the records in a way. He's the one putting the musicians on the radio. So he's got an incredibly important role there as a gatekeeper and creating and showcasing these traditions.
While I was making the film, and I was reminded because somebody in the last week, somebody mentioned how beautiful Anushka is, that there's something about her that is just unbelievably beautiful. And I agree. But Raviji, when we were making the film, we were looking at all these photographs of him all the way through from his teens, and right into old age. He just had the most beautiful face. And it's not just, it's to do with grace. It's to do with the quality of love that's in the face. And it's the essence of beauty. And I'm sure, that's one of the reasons all the women he was a guru after all, and not just in the spiritual sense. I mean, he was as well. He was a great teacher, and therefore he was a channeling something that enables people to open their hearts. And that's what his music does. And I think the lovely thing was that he was conscious of it, but never made a big thing, unlike some Indian gurus who capitalized on whatever grace they had and fell prey to the temptations of the West and everything that went with it. He did, that's the extraordinary thing about it. He did in the end manage to steer that thing between the temptation of the material world and the women flocking around him and celebrity touring with the Rolling Stones in an aeroplane and playing, Monterey and Woodstock. I mean, it could have, as he said to himself, if he'd been a bit younger, it would have, in the film he says, if I'd been a bit younger, it would have gone to my head.
Yeah.
It would have destroyed me. The fact is he was already in his 40s, 50s.
Yeah.
I mean, he was no longer impressionable in that way. But I think more than that, he was above that.
Well, he had a very strong, core.
Yeah.
He was very centered by that point in his life. I mean, and I think that goes back to the kind of salvation moment, if you like, in 1948 that we talked about. I think that he came out of that with a very strong certainty about what he was going to do in his life, and that was music, and then he had a mission. And the music also, he I think it was soothing to him. This is something Anushka said, that there was something damaged within him, but he found a way of managing that. I think the music was the thing that was most soothing, but it was also addictive to him. He was addicted to the road. He was constantly alcoholic, constantly moving on. So some people, addictions come in all kinds of different forms, but that was a conclusion of the book, I think, was that, there was an element of addictive behavior in the fact that he constantly had to move on, constantly touring, and in the relationships with women in that middle period, was a kind of addictive element, I think. But he sort of worked it out on his own. It was before the days of therapy or whatever. And I think the thing that really worked for him was music. And you find that in his interview so often. He says, he's talking about spirituality. He says the way I can access it most strongly is through music. And that was wonderful for him. It was also wonderful for us, because he was so powerful at doing it. And also another thing I love, since I've just talked again about spirituality, was that he talked about it a lot, but he didn't kind of preach about this is the way you have to do it. And so he said, yes, when I play an alap, I'm feeling closest to God. But he also said that, that comes across to the audience, but they might just feel it as feeling relaxed, or they might feel a bit meditative, or, everyone's experience is a little bit different. But maybe we're actually talking about the same kind of feelings. If it has that feeling in you, you don't have to think, oh, now at this moment I'm feeling God. It's everyone has a different kind of approach to that, and he was very open to that. He said, whatever you want to call it, this is the kind of highest point in the music when we go into this very calm, beautiful, meditative passages. So I think he was able to transmit that to so many people, millions ultimately, which is a great power.
Well, I do hope that your book, that it somehow gets out there and encourages people to listen to the music, to go and hear Anushka play, to also look up the old recordings and tune into all of this and discover what a fascinating, because it tells the life, but it also gives one a real sense of the deep quality of the music.
Thank you. Yeah, I hope so. The life is extraordinary. We haven't touched on half of the incredible episodes that happen, but I think you're right. Ultimately, the best reaction I feel that people could get from the book that would make me the most happy is if they want to go and explore the music. So yes, I would encourage them to do that. To whether it's listening to Anushka or any Indian musician who's out there, at your local concert hall once it reopens, or online or whatever. It's a tremendously rich art form, and in so many ways, it's as I saying, very soothing, meditative. It's also a lot of fun and exciting, and tremendous virtuosity. It's got everything, really.
Well, thank you very, very much for sharing all this with me. It's a delight to have the privilege of talking to you as well as reading the book, because it's another dimension. We've talked about it, we've exchanged emails about it a little bit and talked. But this is I'm very grateful to IAAC Literary Festival.
Well, thank you, gentlemen. What an extraordinary conversation grounding Pandit Ravi Shankar's life on a more earthly plane. What you highlighted is not only a hagiographic portrait of a spiritual icon, but a remarkably human life story defined by familial failures, seething rivalries, physical frailty, and relentless ambition. And for anyone who has been moved by a Ravi Shankar recording, what you showcase today is a portrait of the man behind the music and the uncharted waters of his quest to save Indian classical music from extinction. You managed to shatter Panditji's cliched Eastern sage persona and rebuild his reputation as one of the giants of world music. Your conversation today transcended its subject, I'd say, by becoming somewhat larger, I would say something larger than a narrow timeline of an undeniably larger life, as we'd all agree. And so, in using Pandit Ravi Shankar as an axis, you have highlighted a broader cultural history of Indian music, a rather measured rumination on the possibilities and the price of artistic ambition. Thank you, Oliver Craske and Mark Kidel. And thank you to our audience today for staying with us once again. Please consider being a member of IAAC, Indo-American Arts Council, by going to our website at www.iaac.us so that we can continue to bring such amazing programming to you. Goodbye. What an extraordinary conversation grounding Pandit Ravi Shankar's life on a more earthly plane. What you highlighted is not only a hagiographic portrait of a spiritual icon, but a remarkably human life story, defined by familial failures, seething rivalries, physical frailty, and relentless ambition. And for anyone who has been moved by a Ravi Shankar recording, what you showcase today is a portrait of the man behind the music and the uncharted waters of his quest to save Indian classical music from extinction. You managed to shatter Panditji's cliched Eastern sage persona and rebuild his reputation as one of the giants of world music. Your conversation today transcended its subject, I'd say, by becoming somewhat larger, I would say something larger than a narrow timeline of an undeniably larger life, as we'd all agree. And so, in using Pandit Ravi Shankar as an axis, you have highlighted a broader cultural history of Indian music, a rather measured rumination on the possibilities and the price of artistic ambition. Thank you, Oliver Craske and Mark Kidel. And thank you to our audience today for staying with us once again. Please consider being a member of IAAC, Indo-American Arts Council, by going to our website at www.iaac.us so that we can continue to bring such amazing programming to you. Goodbye.
Hello, I'm Neeli Lakhani, IAAC Literary Festival Director. I want to thank you for joining our award-winning authors and their wondrous stories. IAAC is a 501c nonprofit. Programs like the one you just watched happen because of contributions from generous folks like you. Please donate to the IAAC so that we can support our artists and sustain our cultural programs. It is simple to donate by visiting the IAAC website at iaac.us. Learn about the insider benefits that membership gives you. On behalf of the entire IAAC board, stay safe and see you at our next event. Thank you.